Sometimes the truth doesn't whisper. It detonates. The entire Park Avenue Grand Hall fell into stunned silence as the fake pregnancy belly flew across the polished marble floor, landing with a hollow thud in front of 500 of Chicago's most powerful elite. Camera flashes erupted like lightning as Vanessa Monroe, the millionaire's mistress, stood frozen in shame, her elaborate lie exposed for all to see. But this wasn't even the most shocking moment of the evening. Just minutes earlier, Julia Whitman, 7 months pregnant and radiating with silent rage, had stepped onto that same stage to dismantle the man who thought he could throw her away, like yesterday's headlines. With federal agents closing in and her husband's empire unraveling live, Julia delivered the most brutal takedown in Chicago society history. This is the story of how a betrayed pregnant wife brought down a $12 billion media dynasty with nothing but intelligence, resolve, and truth. A story of justice served ice cold and karma broadcast to millions worldwide. If you believe in stories of strong women who refuse to be broken, hit that like button and subscribe for more true tales of revenge and justice. Let's dive into this unforgettable story of betrayal and triumph. The December snow whispered softly against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, each flake catching the warm golden glow from inside like falling diamonds. Julia Whitman stood in the nursery she'd spent months perfecting, one hand resting gently on her 7-month pregnant belly as she adjusted the delicate mobile above the oak crib. The room was a sanctuary of love and luxury. Hand-painted murals of fairy tale scenes, a crystal chandelier throwing rainbows across the ceiling, and shelves lined with the finest toys from across the globe. It was supposed to be their future, their beginning. From the living room, she heard the soft clink of ice against crystal as Carter Whitman poured his third scotch of the evening. He claimed to have just returned from an emergency board meeting. At 36, Carter commanded a $12 billion media empire, Whitman Global, with holdings that stretched from Hollywood production houses to Wall Street networks and luxury publishing. Julia had fallen for his brilliance first, then his drive, and finally, the rare tenderness he showed when no one else was watching. She remembered their wedding day 2 years earlier at the Langham Grand Ballroom, 500 guests, a towering 10-tier cake, and Carter whispering in her ear as they danced, "You're going to be the mother of legends, my love." Now at 28, Julia felt like she was living a fantasy. Their penthouse spanned 2 full floors of Chicago's most elite high-rise, complete with a private elevator, a rooftop infinity pool, and a wine cellar worth more than most people's homes. She had given up her promising architecture career at his gentle insistence, trading her hard hat and blueprints for charity luncheons, black-tie galas, and prenatal yoga classes. "The baby will need you," Carter had said, kissing her forehead, "and I need you focused on our family." She had believed every word. A sharp buzz from Carter's phone cut through the stillness of the nursery. Julia heard him answer in his usual business tone, crisp, commanding. But tonight there was something else in his voice, something softer. "I know, sweetheart," his voice drifted down the hallway. "Tomorrow night, the Langham Room, 2012. Wear that red dress I bought you." Julia's blood turned to ice. Sweetheart. Red dress. Her hands instinctively wrapped around her belly, as if shielding her unborn child from the truth she was hearing. She crept silently down the hallway, her bare feet gliding noiselessly over the Italian marble floors. Carter stood in the living room with his back to her, one hand swirling scotch in a glass, the other gripping his phone with an intimacy she recognized. It was the way he used to hold the phone when he called her in the early days of their love. "I love you too, V. Tomorrow we'll tell the world about us." The crystal mobile hanging in the nursery chimed mockingly in the background as Julia's world collapsed. V. Vanessa Monroe, Carter's personal assistant. She had appeared exactly 8 months ago, right after Julia announced her pregnancy. Julia pictured Vanessa's flawless figure, platinum blonde hair, always perfectly styled, and those signature red-soled Louboutins tapping confidently through the Whitman Global offices. She thought of the way Vanessa's hand lingered a second too long on Carter's shoulder in meetings, the way she always found a reason to accompany him on out-of-town business trips. Julia fled to the bedroom, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it might wake the baby. She sat on the edge of their California king bed, the same bed where Carter had made love to her that very morning, whispering dreams of their shared future. The first tears slipped free, but she didn't have the luxury of falling apart. Raised by a constitutional law professor and a federal judge, Julia had graduated summa cum laude from Stanford before marrying Carter. She had been taught how to stay calm under pressure. With shaking fingers, she reached for Carter's tablet on the nightstand. She reached for Carter's iPad, carelessly left on his nightstand. His password had always been their anniversary, May 9th. Her fingers hovered above the screen. Did she really want to know? With a soft chime, the device unlocked. The evidence hit like a blow to the chest. Months of text messages filled the screen. Conversations between Carter and Vanessa. Photos of candlelit dinners at restaurants Julia had never heard of. Hotel receipts for romantic weekends in Napa Valley. The same weekends Carter had claimed he was in Los Angeles for business meetings. Her breath caught in her throat as she tapped each thread. With every image and line of text, the illusion she had built around her marriage splintered. Her chest tightened, her mouth went dry, and her pulse pounded in her ears. This wasn't just betrayal, it was premeditated erasure of her existence. But the worst were the recent messages. Julia's becoming impossible. All she does is talk about the baby. Vanessa, you're my future. When are you going to leave her? I'm tired of hiding. Once the baby's born, I'll file for custody. A billionaire versus an unemployed pregnant woman? Easy win. And tonight? She's just sitting at home like a cow. Let her. Tomorrow at the charity gala, I'm introducing you as my partner. The whole world will know. You're mine. Julia's hands trembled so hard she nearly dropped the iPad. Partner. Tomorrow. The gala. It all made sense now. The annual Whitman Foundation benefit at Park Avenue Grand Hall, where Carter donated millions and paraded his reputation before Chicago's most powerful. Julia had planned to attend with him, to stand proudly at his side as his wife, their unborn child visible beneath her gown. Now she knew why he had insisted she stay home. You need your rest, Jules, he had said just yesterday. The gala will be loud and stressful. Think of the baby. She kept scrolling, each message another knife to her chest. Vanessa, did you transfer the money? Carter, $50 million as promised. Consider it an early wedding gift. Perfect. I've already put the down payment on the Napa estate, our home. Julia felt bile rise in her throat. 50 million. Not just a number. It was the price tag on her trust, her future, her dreams. He had sold off their child's legacy to fund another woman's fantasy. Every dollar wired to Vanessa was a piece of Julia's heart, ripped away and handed over like spare change. $50 million. Their money. The money she'd meticulously saved for their child's future. Gone. And the house in Napa, where she had dreamed of raising their family, where she had spent last summer designing the nursery, was now being bought for another woman. She heard Carter's footsteps approaching. In a panic, she shut the iPad and adjusted the pillows, trying to look casual, but her pale complexion and tear-rimmed eyes betrayed her. Jules? Carter's voice was soft, concerned, loving even, the same tone he had just used with his mistress. Are you feeling okay? You look pale. She looked up at the man she had once trusted with everything, her life, her future, her heart. His dark hair was immaculately styled, his green eyes radiating concern. His 6'2" frame was flawless in a custom Armani suit. He looked every bit the perfect husband, the ideal father-to-be. I'm fine, Julia whispered, her voice barely audible. Just tired. Carter sat on the edge of the bed and placed a warm hand on her belly. For a brief moment, Julia felt a flicker of hope. Maybe she'd misinterpreted things. Maybe there was still an explanation. How's our little prince doing tonight? He asked. Julia felt the baby kick at the sound of his voice. Prince? She asked, trying to keep her tone neutral. We don't know the gender yet. Carter's smile faltered for just a second. Just a feeling, he replied quickly, then added, though honestly, I hope it's a boy. Someone to carry on the Whitman name properly. The offhanded cruelty in his words hit Julia like a slap, as if she was nothing more than a vessel for his legacy. She looked at him now with new eyes, noticed how his smile no longer reached his eyes, how he glanced at his phone constantly, even in moments like these, how he spoke about their unborn child like a stock acquisition. Carter, she said, her voice steadier now, can I ask you something? Of course, sweetheart. he answered smoothly, using the same endearment he had whispered to Vanessa. Are you happy? She asked. With us? With this? She gestured to the room, the crib, her belly, the life they had built. For a moment, his polished mask slipped. She caught the glimmer of calculation in his eyes, a flash of annoyance, maybe even disgust. But then, as quickly as it came, the facade returned. Of course I'm happy, Jules. You're carrying my child. What more could I possibly want? What more, indeed? A woman who wasn't becoming impossible? A woman who didn't talk endlessly about babies? A woman like Vanessa Monroe, with her red dress and her $50 million bank account. I love you, Julia said softly, testing him, searching for any sign that he might still care. Love you too, he replied automatically, his hand already reaching for his phone the moment it buzzed. His face lit up as he read the message, the same way it used to light up when she texted him in the early days. That night, Julia lay awake in silence, her hand resting on her belly as the baby stirred inside her. She listened to Carter's steady breathing, memorizing every detail of the man who planned to humiliate her tomorrow in front of 500 of Chicago's most powerful figures. Tomorrow, at the Whitman Foundation Gala, he planned to cast her aside, replace her with a woman who saw her as nothing more than a hurdle. But Julia Whitman wasn't just the daughter of esteemed legal scholars. She wasn't just a pregnant woman to be discarded when she became inconvenient. And she sure as hell wasn't going to fade quietly while her husband and his mistress built a fantasy on the ruins of her life. As the first rays of dawn slipped through the curtains, Julia made a decision, one that would change everything. She thought of her unborn child, of the life they deserved, of the justice that was long overdue. But Julia Whitman was not just the daughter of Stanford intellectuals. She wasn't just a pregnant woman to be discarded when she no longer fit into someone else's vision of success. And she absolutely was not going to disappear quietly while her husband and his mistress built their new future on the rubble of her heart. As the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, Julia made a decision, one that would alter the course of everything. She thought of her unborn child, of the life they deserved, of the justice that had to be served. Carter and Vanessa had made one fatal error. They had underestimated her. They were about to find out how costly that mistake would be. The morning after Julia's devastating discovery, Carter left early for the office, claiming he had to finalize arrangements for the gala that evening. From the bedroom window, Julia watched as he adjusted his hair in the hallway mirror, spending a little extra time perfecting his look before heading out. Once his Bentley merged into Chicago's rush-hour traffic, Julia allowed herself exactly 5 minutes. 5 minutes to cry, to grieve the death of her marriage, the collapse of her trust, the end of her dream of the perfect family. Then she wiped her tears, poured herself a cup of decaf, and got to work. Julia had always been precise, methodical, a trait that served her well in architecture, and one that would serve her even better now. She started in Carter's home office, a mahogany-paneled retreat he believed was entirely private. Using the research tactics she once honed on Stanford's competitive debate team, she began documenting everything. The first bombshell came within an hour. Buried beneath insurance paperwork and corporate contracts, she found a burner phone. The message history was sickening. The affair hadn't started when Vanessa was hired. It had been going on for over a year. They had begun planning Julia's replacement before she was even pregnant. Vanessa, the wife is starting to question our dinner meetings. Should we back off a bit? Don't worry, Julia's too trusting for her own good. Once she's pregnant, she'll be too distracted to notice anything. Vanessa, you're really going to get her pregnant just to keep her busy? It's perfect. She'll be bloated and emotional for 9 months, then too tired with the baby to focus on us. And by the time she figures it out, we'll be gone, with half the assets. Julia's hand instinctively covered her belly. Her pregnancy, the child she had prayed for, had been nothing more than a strategic distraction, a pawn, a tactic to keep her docile while Carter plotted her betrayal. But the texts revealed something even darker. Carter and Vanessa hadn't just been planning to leave her. They had been planning to destroy her. The prenup protects most of my assets, but she could still make trouble. We need to paint her as an unfit mother. How? Vanessa asked. Document everything. Carter replied, the mood swings, the tears, her erratic behavior. Make it look like postpartum depression. With the right lawyers and enough evidence, I can get full custody. She'll be lucky to get supervised visitation. And if that doesn't work? Vanessa asked again. There are other ways to deal with difficult problems, Carter said coldly. Don't worry about that. The sheer callousness in his words hit Julia like a slap. The man she had once believed would move mountains to protect her and their child was plotting to rip them apart like an inconvenient business deal. Her stomach twisted. Every word was a calculated strategy, one that saw her not as a mother, but as an obstacle. The casual cruelty in their messages, the way they plotted to tear her apart, to rip her away from her own child, made Julia physically nauseous. But she forced herself to keep going, to capture every word, every detail. If they wanted to play dirty, she would meet them prepared. With trembling hands, Julia photographed each message with her own phone. Her mind drifted back to her college years. Most people only knew Julia Whitman as the brilliant architect who married Chicago's most eligible billionaire. But few knew she had once been one of Stanford's most talented investigative researchers. She had helped expose 2 major academic fraud rings and had received recruitment offers from multiple federal agencies before choosing architecture instead. Those memories came flooding back now, not as nostalgia, but as armor. The woman Carter tried to erase was still here, smarter and more dangerous than he ever realized. Now, it was time to revive those skills. For the next 6 hours, Julia dove into the most intense investigation of her life. She found offshore account records, proof that Carter had been discreetly funneling company money into private accounts under Vanessa's name. She traced the business trips to Napa Valley, exposing them as romantic getaways charged to Whitman Global's expense account under the guise of client entertainment. But the most damning evidence? She discovered Carter had been embezzling money from the Whitman Foundation, the very nonprofit being honored that night at the gala. Over the past year, he had siphoned off nearly $100 million meant for children's hospitals and education grants into personal accounts. And then came the final blow. Using digital forensic skills she had picked up from a brief relationship with a cybersecurity expert years ago, Julia began digging into Vanessa Monroe's background. What she found changed everything. Vanessa Monroe didn't exist. The woman Carter planned to leave his wife for, the woman who had received $50 million of marital funds, was actually named Nina Rodriguez. And Nina Rodriguez had a criminal history that stretched across 3 states. Identity theft in California, fraud in Arizona, embezzlement in Florida. She was a career con artist, a professional predator who specialized in seducing and exploiting wealthy, lonely men. She had changed her appearance, fabricated a new identity, and methodically infiltrated Julia's marriage from the inside out. But it was the final piece of evidence that made Julia's blood run cold. Hidden deep within Vanessa's medical files, files she had carelessly accessed through Carter's personal computer, was the truth. She wasn't pregnant at all. The sonogram images she had shown Carter were pulled from the internet. The morning sickness, the prenatal visits, the future she promised him. All of it an elaborate lie. Julia sat in Carter's leather office chair, surrounded by folders, screenshots, and photographs. Strangely, a wave of calm washed over her. The pain was still there. It probably always would be. But grief had transformed into something far more powerful: ammunition. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. The name on the screen made her heart skip. Marcus Lee. She hadn't heard from him in years. Marcus had been her closest friend and study partner back in Stanford Law before she changed course to pursue architecture. He was also the only man she had ever truly loved before Carter. The one she gave up to chase a life of glamour and stability. Julia, Marcus's voice was warm, steady, and full of concern. I hope it's okay that I called. I saw the Whitman Foundation Gala announcement in the Tribune, and, well, I've been hearing things about Carter. Julia's throat tightened at the sound of genuine kindness. What kind of things? She asked softly. The kind that make me worry, he said. About you. A pause. I know it's been years, but I have to ask, are you safe, Julia? Are you happy? The simple question cracked something deep inside her, and suddenly she was telling him everything. The affair, the embezzlement, The fake pregnancy, the plan to take her baby. Marcus listened in silence, the only sound on the line his quiet, steady breathing. "Jesus, Julia," he finally whispered. "You need to get out of there. Today. Now." "I can't," she said, shocked by the steadiness in her voice. "I'm not running, Marcus. I'm fighting." "What do you mean?" "Carter plans to humiliate me tonight at the gala," she said. "He's going to parade his mistress in front of everyone, make me look irrelevant. But he's made one critical mistake." "What's that?" "He has no idea who he's really married to." Julia laid out her plan, calm, methodical, strategic, and Marcus listened in stunned silence. When she finished, he didn't speak for several seconds. Marcus finally spoke. "What you're planning, it's brilliant, but it's also incredibly risky. Carter Whitman is one of the most powerful men in Chicago. If this goes sideways, you could lose everything." Julia's voice didn't waver. "Marcus, I've already lost everything. The man I loved never existed. The marriage I built my life around? A lie. The only thing I have left to lose is my self-respect, and I'm not giving that up too." The silence between them pulsed with unspoken understanding. Marcus had always known, that Julia didn't back down, not when something mattered, and nothing mattered more than the child growing inside her and the truth that had been buried beneath Carter's empire. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "Legal backup, media contacts, and a friend." "You have all three. Always." As Julia ended the call, something stirred deep in her chest, something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. Not the naive hope of reconciliation or redemption, but a grounded, powerful hope for justice, for truth, for a future where her child would know their mother stood her ground, even when the world tried to silence her. She glanced at the clock on Carter's desk. 3 p.m. The gala began at 7. She had 4 hours to prepare for the most important performance of her life. Julia Whitman was about to show Chicago's elite that behind every man who betrays his vows, there's a woman sharp enough to burn down his kingdom. The war was just beginning. Julia stood in front of her walk-in closet, her gaze fixed on the reflection in the three-way mirror. At 7 months pregnant, her body had changed dramatically from the elegant architect Carter had once pursued. Her figure was fuller, her hips wider, her breasts heavier, her belly round and undeniable. Carter hadn't looked at her with desire in months, and somewhere along the way, she'd started seeing herself through his eyes, as someone useful, but no longer desired. But the woman in the mirror tonight was different. Her eyes were clear, fierce, her posture unshaken. For the first time in a long while, she didn't see failure or weakness, she saw fire. Not tonight. Tonight she was reclaiming everything. She chose a black Chanel maternity gown she had bought months ago but never worn. It was elegant, sleek, and designed to embrace, not conceal, her pregnancy. Every stitch made a statement. "I am not ashamed. I am proud. I am powerful. I am a mother." As she dressed, Julia's phone buzzed again. Updates from Marcus. True to his promise, he had mobilized fast. 3 major media outlets would be covering the event, not just society photographers. And a discreet FBI task force had been coordinated to attend, ready to act on the financial crimes Julia had uncovered. "Marcus, everything's in place. You sure about this?" Julia typed back without hesitation. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." She turned to her jewelry box, carefully selecting each piece like armor. The diamond necklace Carter had given her on their first anniversary. The sapphire earrings from their engagement. The wedding ring that now felt more like a shackle than a symbol of love. Each piece told part of a story. The story of a woman once cherished, now betrayed. As Julia applied her makeup, her gaze settled on her handbag. Inside were 3 USB drives. Each contained digital copies of everything she had uncovered. Financial records, fraudulent transfers, text messages, and proof of Vanessa's true identity as Nina Rodriguez. One drive was for the FBI, one for the press, and the third, her insurance policy. Her phone rang. Carter's name lit up the screen. "Jules," his voice was smooth, sweet, carefully composed. "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" "I'm fine, Carter. Just getting ready for tonight." There was a pause. "Getting ready?" he repeated. "Julia, we talked about this. You need to rest. The gala's going to be too much, the noise, the people. It's not safe for you or the baby." "Actually, I feel incredible," she said lightly. "The best I've felt in months. I wouldn't miss it for the world." She could hear the panic creeping into his voice. "Julia, listen to me. This isn't a good idea. There'll be flashing cameras, music, a crowd. For someone in my condition? She asked evenly. You mean someone pregnant with your child? Someone carrying the future of Whitman Global? That's not what I meant, and you know it. Do I? Her voice stayed calm. I've had a lot on my mind lately, Carter, about our marriage, our future. There are a few things I'd like to talk about tonight. The silence on the line stretched. 20 seconds. 30. When he finally spoke again, the warmth in his tone was gone. What kind of things? Oh, just a few questions. About finances. About long-term strategy. About partnership. Nothing urgent. She smiled. We'll discuss it tonight. See you at the gala, darling. She hung up before he could respond. Julia knew what would happen next. Carter would call Vanessa, Nina, warning her. They'd scramble. They'd panic. But it was already too late. The trap had been set. The wheels were already turning. At exactly 6 p.m., the doorbell rang. She wasn't expecting anyone. Curious, she checked the monitor and immediately smiled. It was Maria Alvarez, her former assistant from the architecture firm. More than a colleague, Maria had been a friend, a trusted confidante, someone who had believed in Julia's brilliance even after her marriage had shifted her path. Maria? Julia opened the door, surprised. What are you doing here? Marcus called me, Maria said, stepping inside with purpose. He told me what's going on, Julia. I'm so sorry, Maria said, stepping fully into the foyer. I always suspected Carter was off, but I never imagined it was this bad. She handed Julia a small object, no bigger than a button. It's a hidden camera and mic, she explained. Marcus thought you might want to record whatever happens tonight, for legal protection. Julia turned the device over in her hand, marveling at how unremarkable it looked. Where did Marcus even get this? She asked. Apparently, he has some fascinating contacts. Maria said with a half smile. The camera's virtually undetectable, and the microphone can pick up voices from up to 50 feet away. Everything's streamed to a secure server. It can't be hacked or erased. As Maria helped her pin the device discreetly into the lining of her dress, she lowered her voice. There's something else I need to tell you, she said. After you left the architecture firm to marry Carter, he came to see me. Julia tensed. He offered me money to spy on you. He wanted updates about your friends, your meetings, your conversations. He asked if you were seeing anyone, if you seemed unhappy, if there was anything he should know. Julia's blood ran cold. Did you take it? I told him to go to hell, Maria said sharply. But Julia, that means he's been watching you for years, controlling you, in ways you probably never noticed. Julia's knees weakened slightly at the realization, the kind that reshapes your entire past in one breath. Every subtle redirection, every lost friendship, every step she thought she took freely, suddenly tinged with his manipulation. The betrayal felt fresh all over again, but beneath it surged something harder, sharper. Resolve. It shouldn't have shocked her. But it did. Carter's control hadn't come in the form of harsh commands. It had been subtle, gradual, and persistent. The casual suggestions that slowly became non-negotiable. The friends who drifted away. The job offers he deemed inappropriate for a married woman. She had called it compromise. He had called it love. But it had all been control. Disguised in charm, masked by affection. Maria, Julia said, steadying her breath. I need you to do something for me. Anything. If something happens to me tonight, if I don't come home, or if I disappear, or if anything feels wrong, I need you to go to Detective Ramirez at the CPD. Ask him to open the safe deposit box at First National Bank, box 3372. Everything's in there. Maria's eyes widened. Julia, what are you planning? Justice, Julia said, and freedom. At 6:30 p.m. sharp, Julia's ride pulled up. Not the chauffeured Bentley Carter usually sent, but a modest black sedan arranged by Marcus. As it carried her through the snow-dusted streets of Chicago toward the Park Avenue Grand Hall, Julia felt an unfamiliar stillness settle over her. For the first time in months, the fog had cleared. She finally understood why her marriage had collapsed, why Carter had become a stranger, why she had felt like a ghost in her own life. Now everything made sense. None of it had been her fault. Julia had spent years blaming herself, wondering what she'd done wrong, why her marriage had fractured, why the man she loved had turned into a stranger. But the truth was simple. She had been living with a predator, a man who had systematically isolated her, manipulated her, and planned to discard her once she had served her purpose. But predators make one fatal mistake. They underestimate their prey. As the black sedan pulled up to the Park Avenue Grand Hall, Julia could already see the red carpet lined with photographers and news crews. The annual Whitman Foundation Gala was one of Chicago's most elite events, drawing billionaires, celebrities, politicians, and global dignitaries. Tonight, they would all bear witness to the truth. Julia glanced at her reflection one last time in the car's mirror. She looked radiant, not in spite of her pregnancy, but because of it. She looked like what she truly was, a woman of strength, resolve, and fire, a mother ready to fight for herself and her child. "Mrs. Whitman," the driver asked, "are you ready?" Julia placed a hand over her belly, feeling her baby stir. "We're ready," she said, stepping onto the red carpet. Camera flashes erupted instantly, bathing her in white light. She smiled softly, waving like the perfect billionaire's wife at another glamorous charity event. No one in the crowd could have guessed they were about to witness the most seismic scandal in Chicago society history. Julia walked through the grand glass entrance, head high, spine straight. She wasn't just entering a gala. She was walking into a reckoning. Inside, the ballroom of the grand hall had been transformed into a vision of opulence. Crystal chandeliers bathed the room in warm light. White silk covered every table. The centerpieces, towering arrangements of orchids and baby's breath, glowed under the soft lighting. 500 of Chicago's most powerful guests mingled in evening wear worth more than some homes. Julia arrived fashionably late, just as Carter took the stage to deliver his opening remarks. She spotted him immediately from the back of the room. He was a vision of curated perfection in a custom Tom Ford tuxedo. His dark hair glistened under the lights. His voice echoed with the confidence and charisma that had once captivated her heart. "Ladies and gentlemen," Carter's voice boomed through the sound system, "welcome to the 10th Annual Whitman Foundation Gala. Tonight we gather not only to celebrate what we've accomplished, but to commit ourselves to an even brighter future, for the children and families who depend on our work." Then she saw her. Nina, sitting front and center at the head table. Draped in a crimson Valentino gown, her blonde hair styled in a regal chignon, her belly rounded beneath flowing silk. Fake, all of it. She was playing her part to perfection, the glowing, expectant mistress, the soon-to-be Mrs. Whitman. As Carter droned on about family values and legacy giving, Julia began making her way through the crowd. Heads turned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The real Mrs. Whitman had arrived. She had been absent from Chicago's social scene for months. Her presence tonight was as unexpected as it was electrifying. Whispers followed her like a shadow. "Is that Julia Whitman? I thought she was on bed rest. She looks radiant, doesn't she? I heard there were issues in the marriage." Julia made her way to an empty table near the back of the ballroom, her heartbeat racing, but her face composed, calm, unreadable. From across the grand hall, she saw Carter spot her. Even at that distance, she noticed it, the tiniest flicker in his expression. His charming, confident smile faltered just for a second before snapping back into place. But that was all Julia needed. She had grown up playing poker with her father. She knew a tell when she saw one. Carter rushed through the rest of his opening remarks, the ease in his voice thinning slightly. The knowledge that his very pregnant wife, whom he had firmly instructed to stay home, was now seated in his audience, clearly shook him. When the polite applause finally rolled through the room, Julia watched as he leaned toward Nina, and whispered something into her ear. Vanessa's head snapped around instantly, her gaze darting across the room until it locked with Julia's. Even from a distance, Julia saw it, that unmistakable flash of panic, quickly replaced by icy defiance. Vanessa turned back to Carter, whispering rapidly, their conversation clearly strained, clearly unplanned. Julia raised her water glass in a slow, knowing toast. Let them panic. The first course arrived, seared foie gras with champagne reduction. A string quartet played Vivaldi in the background. Julia barely tasted a thing. Her mind was fixed on the USB drive, hidden in her clutch, and the tiny hidden camera sewn into her dress, capturing every expression, every word, every lie unraveling in real time. Each second that passed tightened a coil inside her chest. Rage wound around grief, grief tangled with defiance. She was sitting at the table like any other socialite, but beneath the polished calm, she was a storm-gathering force. This wasn't revenge for heartbreak. This was about reclaiming her dignity. This was about telling the truth in a room built on illusion. Around her, Chicago's elite clinked glasses and traded tips on markets and winter homes in Aspen, completely unaware that their evening was on the brink of historic scandal. During the soup course, Carter rose from the head table. He moved through the crowd with deliberate ease, the perfect image of a caring, doting husband. Julia watched him come closer, noted how quickly he had readjusted his mask. "Jules," he said with that familiar warmth, bending to kiss her cheek as society photographers snapped their cameras. "You look stunning tonight." "But sweetheart, what are you doing here? We agreed you'd stay home and rest." Julia looked up at him, eyes wide, voice soft. "Oh, Carter, I felt so much better today, and I couldn't miss your big night." She smiled sweetly and placed her hand on her belly. "I wanted our baby to be here for Daddy's important speech." His jaw clenched for just a second. But of course he smiled. "Well, I'm glad you're feeling up to it," Carter said, his tone still wrapped in a public-friendly smile. "Though perhaps you should head home after dinner. The program goes late, and—" "Actually," Julia interrupted smoothly, her voice even, graceful. "I was hoping I could say a few words tonight about the Foundation's work with children, from the perspective of an expectant mother." She let the sentence hang in the air, her eyes steady on his. "I'm sure the guests would love to hear about our hopes for the future, our family's future." Carter visibly paled. "Julia, that's not— the program's already finalized. There's no room for additional speakers." "Oh, I'm sure we can make time," she said brightly. "After all, who better to speak about children's charities than someone carrying a child of her own?" Around them, other guests began to take note. Conversations quieted. Curious glances were exchanged. Carter's eyes darted, calculating. He was clearly scrambling for a way to shut her down without making a scene. "We'll talk about it later," he said at last, his smile stretched thin. "Enjoy your dinner, darling." As he turned away, Julia watched him make a sharp detour, whispering something to several men in dark suits stationed along the ballroom's edge. Security. He was alerting them, prepping them, no doubt telling them to keep an eye on his unstable emotional wife and to be ready to remove her if she stepped out of line. The irony was delicious. He thought he was protecting his perfectly crafted event. In reality, he was helping set the stage for his own public downfall. The main course arrived, Wagyu beef with truffle demi-glace. Served as speeches from board members and beneficiaries filled the air with practiced optimism. Julia barely tasted a bite. Her mind was elsewhere. She was rehearsing her words. Every fact, every number, every weaponized truth she'd be delivering in just a few minutes. By the time dessert hit the tables, dark chocolate soufflé with gold leaf, Carter rose once more. The moment had arrived. This was traditionally the emotional high point of the evening, the part where Carter would speak about legacy, values, and announce the fundraising total. "Friends," Carter began, his voice smooth, confident, practiced. "Tonight, we have raised over $50 million for children in need." Polite applause rippled through the ballroom. "These funds will build hospitals, fund scholarships, and deliver hope to families across our great nation." Julia's stomach turned. The irony burned. This man had embezzled nearly twice that amount. He was praising generosity, all while secretly funneling charitable donations into offshore accounts and luxury real estate for his mistress. As if sensing her anger, the baby kicked hard. But Carter wasn't done. He smiled warmly. "But beyond the numbers," he continued, "tonight is about something deeper. It's about love, family, about building something greater than ourselves." Julia's hand tightened around the stem of her glass. The moment was almost here. "Speaking of family," Carter said, and Julia felt her blood run cold. She knew what was coming. "I have a very special announcement to make tonight," he continued, his voice brimming with faux sincerity. "As many of you know, my wife Julia and I are expecting our first child." He paused, allowing polite applause to ripple through the room. "But what you don't know," he added with a grin, "is that we've recently learned we're actually expecting twins." The lie hit Julia like a slap. The room burst into delighted applause. Several guests turned in their seats, smiling at her with joy and congratulations. Julia sat frozen, stunned by the audacity of it all. But Carter wasn't finished. "And I'm even more thrilled to share that Julia and I have decided to expand our family in another way," he said, his tone positively saintly. "We're pleased to introduce you to someone very special, Vanessa Monroe, who will be joining our family through adoption proceedings." He gestured toward Vanessa, who stood gracefully and placed a hand over her fake pregnant belly. Gasps, more applause, smiles all around. The implication was clear. The Whitmans weren't just expecting twins, they were also adopting a child from a gracious, selfless woman in need. A perfect PR move. Julia's breath caught, her chest tightening with disbelief. This was it. Carter's master illusion. A web of lies so intricately spun it cloaked betrayal in benevolence. His affair cloaked in charity, his deceit paraded as devotion. Julia felt the chill of realization sweep over her. In a single masterstroke, Carter had reframed every piece of damning truth. Vanessa's fake pregnancy was now a noble adoption. His affair became an act of compassion. And any outburst Julia made tonight? He had already painted her as fragile, hormonal, unstable. It was brilliant, manipulative, evil. And yet what burned more than the betrayal was the applause. The room, her world, clapped for the lie, not knowing the cost. Not knowing the woman they were applauding had been betrayed, erased, rebranded. But it was also the final straw. Julia rose slowly from her seat. Her chair scraped loudly against the polished floor, drawing immediate attention. The applause died. All eyes turned toward her as she made her way to the stage, one hand resting protectively on her belly. "Actually," Julia said, her voice calm, measured, but clear enough to carry through the acoustics of the hall. "I think there are a few things about our family that need clarification." Carter went pale. Julia ascended the steps to the stage. A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd. Guests leaned forward, intrigued. No one moved to stop her. Who was going to silence a pregnant woman at a charity gala? Julia stepped up to the podium. Carter stood frozen beside her. He couldn't drag her away without looking violent. He couldn't stop her without making headlines. "Good evening," Julia said into the microphone, her voice steady and strong. "For those who don't know me, I'm Julia Whitman. And yes, I am expecting a child with Carter." She paused, resting her hand visibly on her belly. Flashbulbs popped across the ballroom, capturing her expression, her stance, her truth. The real Mrs. Whitman had taken the mic. "However," Julia said, her voice firm yet composed, "I need to correct my husband's announcement." A hush fell over the ballroom. "We are not expecting twins." A ripple of confusion swept through the audience. "I am carrying one child," she continued, "conceived 8 months ago, during what I believed was a loving and faithful marriage." Now the silence became electric. Where was this going? "And I also need to clarify the adoption story my husband just shared." Julia's gaze swept over the room, locking briefly on Vanessa, who sat stone-faced, her hand still resting on that artificial bump. "The truth is," Julia said clearly, "Vanessa Monroe is not a brave, expectant mother we're helping through adoption. She is my husband's mistress, and she has been having an affair with him for over a year." The collective gasp from 500 stunned guests echoed like thunder. Camera flashes went wild. Phones were raised. Media reporters scrambled to capture what was now officially the scandal of the decade. Julia took a breath and kept going. "Furthermore," she said, her voice unwavering, "the pregnancy Vanessa is displaying tonight is a complete fabrication. She is not pregnant." Her hand moved to her clutch. "She's wearing a prosthetic belly as part of an elaborate deception." She pulled out the USB drive and held it high for all to see. "I have documented evidence of their affair. Thousands of text messages, financial records showing Carter funneled over $50 million of Whitman Foundation money to her." Gasps turned into stunned murmurs. "And," Julia added, "proof that Vanessa Monroe is actually Nina Rodriguez, a convicted con artist with charges of fraud and identity theft in 3 different states." The room erupted. Voices shouted, phones recorded. People turned to one another in disbelief. From the corner of her eye, Julia spotted Carter's security detail moving toward the stage. But she wasn't done. "Do you want to know the most devastating betrayal?" she asked, raising her voice above the growing noise. "According to private messages between them, my pregnancy was not born out of love." She paused, let it sink in. "It was a strategy. To keep me, quote, fat and emotional, while they transferred assets, laundered money, and planned to leave me with nothing. Julia turned and looked directly at Carter. He stood beside her, rigid and pale, his polished image crumbling under the weight of every word. He planned to take our child away from me by claiming I was mentally unstable. They documented my reactions, my pregnancy symptoms, my tears, my confusion as evidence. Their goal, she said to the room now, was to leave me with no money, no baby, and no voice. She looked out at the crowd. Some people stood, some recorded, some shouted their support. But Julia didn't flinch. They made one critical mistake, she said, her voice rising in strength. They assumed I was still the same naive woman Carter Whitman married 5 years ago. They forgot, Julia said, her voice steady and rising, that I graduated summa cum laude from Harvard. A wave of murmurs rippled through the audience. That I built a successful architecture firm before I gave it all up for love. Her gaze cut across the ballroom like a blade, and that I have never, never backed down from a fight when someone threatens my family. There was power in her tone, not just in the words, but in the weight behind them. The years of silence, of sacrifice, of swallowing her truth. Tonight, she was done swallowing. Tonight, she roared. As if summoned by her words, federal agents began to enter the grand hall from every entrance. Julia spotted Marcus near the back, calm, composed, speaking to the lead agent and gesturing toward the stage. The evidence I've gathered over the past week, Julia continued, has already been handed over to federal authorities. She didn't blink. Carter Whitman will be arrested tonight for embezzlement, tax evasion, and fraud. More gasps, shouts. The ballroom exploded with sound. The $50 million he stole from children's charities will be recovered and returned to its rightful purpose. Carter finally found his voice. Julia, stop this, he barked, his tone desperate. You're having a breakdown. The pregnancy, it's made you unstable. You need help. It was exactly the wrong thing to say. Everyone in the room saw it. The contrast between a calm, composed, clearly pregnant woman and a sweating, unraveling billionaire trying to gaslight her in public. Julia turned to him and smiled, with something that almost resembled pity. The only help I needed, Carter, she said, was help seeing you for who you really are. She looked out over the crowd. And now everyone else can see you too. Then it happened. Vanessa, Nina, cracked. Unable to endure the scrutiny a moment longer, she bolted from her seat and made a beeline for the exit. But in her blind panic, she tripped. Time slowed. The fake pregnancy belly broke free and flew across the ballroom, landing with a hollow thud in front of the head table. The sound echoed like a gavel striking down judgment. For 3 perfect seconds, silence reigned. Then chaos. Reporters surged forward. Cameras flashed like lightning. Guests gasped, shouted, and scrambled for position. And through it all, Julia stood at the podium, serene, unmoving, one hand resting over her very real, very alive baby bump. She watched as federal agents closed in around Carter. Carter Whitman, the lead agent said loud enough for everyone to hear, "You're under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent." Handcuffs clicked. Carter glanced back over his shoulder, his face twisted in hatred. Julia felt nothing. No sadness, no nostalgia, no regret. The man she had loved had never truly existed. What stood before her now was just a criminal finally facing justice. Vanessa, Nina, was being questioned across the ballroom, agents retrieving the prosthetic belly from the floor. Her mask of elegance had shattered. She was sobbing, makeup streaked, trying to explain the unexplainable. Julia felt a strange calm, like the eye of a long, violent storm finally passing. Julia turned back to the microphone one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice steady, "I apologize for disrupting your evening." She paused, then added, "But I hope you understand. When someone threatens your child, you do whatever it takes to protect them." "Thank you for your attention," Julia said into the microphone, her voice clear, calm, and powerful. "And please, continue to support legitimate children's charities in the future." The standing ovation began almost instantly. It lasted nearly 10 minutes. As Julia stepped down from the stage, she was immediately surrounded by reporters, by guests, by people clapping her on the back and whispering words like brave, incredible, inspiring. But the person she was most relieved to see, standing just beyond the crowd, his eyes shining, was Marcus Lee. "That," Marcus said, stepping forward, was the most courageous thing I've ever witnessed. Julia smiled, her chest lifting with something she hadn't felt in years. Freedom. It was the most honest thing I've done, she said softly. They walked together toward the exit, past flashing cameras and murmuring onlookers. Julia could already see the headlines forming in her mind. Pregnant wife exposes billionaire's affair on stage. Mistress flees as FBI arrests CEO during gala. But she knew those headlines would only capture the spectacle. They wouldn't capture the sleepless nights, the tears cried alone in the dark, the weight of betrayal pressing on her every breath. The real story was about something much deeper. It was about a woman who reclaimed her voice, protected her child, and refused to be broken. It was about survival and rebirth, about choosing self-worth over silence. It was about Julia Whitman's rebirth. 6 months later, Julia sat in the nursery of her new brownstone in Chicago's Lincoln Park. The early spring sun streamed through the windows, lighting up the gentle sage-green walls and the clean, warm hardwood floors. She rocked her 3-month-old son, Ethan Marcus Whitman, gently in her arms. Outside, in the little private garden, tulips were beginning to bloom. She planned to teach him to walk there one day. The room was filled with soft textures, cozy corners, and love, not status. Framed prints of iconic architectural landmarks lined the walls, a quiet homage to the career Julia had slowly begun to return to. Ethan stirred, letting out a tiny sigh in his sleep. His dark hair caught the light. He had Carter's coloring, yes, but Julia's eyes. Bright, sharp, curious. She had once feared she might look at her child and only see the man who had betrayed her. But now she saw only Ethan. His tiny fingers wrapped around hers, anchoring her to the present, to possibility. His own person, unmarked by his father's sins, full of promise. The legal fallout had moved quickly. Once Julia turned over her evidence, Carter Whitman was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for embezzlement, tax fraud, and conspiracy. The judge had been blunt. His betrayal, the judge said, wasn't just of his wife, but of thousands of vulnerable children whose futures he had gambled for personal gain. As for Vanessa Monroe, real name Nina Rodriguez, she received 5 years for conspiracy and fraud. The court ordered restitution, but most of the money had vanished into gambling debts and high-end designer shopping sprees. There wasn't much to recover. But Julia had learned something important. Justice wasn't only about punishment, it was about healing, about reclaiming what was stolen, not just the money, but dignity, voice, power. It was about restoration, about rebuilding what had once been torn apart. The Whitman Foundation had undergone a complete restructure under new leadership, with Julia now serving as a key member of its advisory board. The stolen funds had been recovered and were already in use. Construction had begun on the pediatric cancer wing at Northwestern Memorial, a promise Carter had once made and never intended to keep. On a more personal level, Julia used her divorce settlement to launch the Phoenix Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to helping women escape financially abusive relationships. The organization provided legal aid, financial literacy programs, and emergency shelter for women and children fleeing domestic abuse. "You're thinking about work again, aren't you?" Marcus said from the doorway, his voice warm. Julia looked up from her rocking chair and smiled. Marcus had been her quiet constant throughout the storm of the past year. He never rushed her, never asked for more than she could give. But he had always been there, steadfast, steady. Their relationship had resumed gradually, this time not as young lovers chasing passion, but as two adults building something real, something rooted in mutual values and deep understanding. "Guilty," Julia said with a soft laugh. "We got 3 new cases this week. One woman whose husband has been hiding money in crypto wallets, another whose partner tanked her credit score, and a teenager whose boyfriend convinced her to take out credit cards in her name to fund his startup." Marcus stepped inside and sat in the second rocking chair beside her. At 36, he had grown into one of Chicago's most respected civil rights attorneys. His hair was starting to silver at the temples. There were soft laugh lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when they were students at Harvard. "The teenager sounds familiar," he said gently. "Wasn't that how Nina got started?" "Almost exactly," Julia nodded. "It's a pattern. Financial predators know how to target emotionally vulnerable people, especially the young. That's why our teen outreach program is so important. She glanced down at Ethan, who was sleeping peacefully in her arms, and then around the nursery, so calm, so warm, so filled with purpose. "Sometimes I think about how different things could have been," she admitted. "If I hadn't seen those messages, if I had just kept trusting Carter, if I'd been too scared to fight back." "But you did fight back," Marcus said, his voice steady. "You saved yourself, and you saved Ethan." He looked at her with pride. "And more than that, Julia, you've saved hundreds of women with your foundation. The impact of what you did that night at the Grand Hall, it's still rippling out." It was true. Julia's story had been covered extensively in the media, but not just as a glamorous scandal. It became something more, an international symbol of empowerment. She had appeared on the cover of Time magazine, honored as one of their people who changed the world. Her memoir, Breaking Free: A Mother's Fight for Justice, had spent 20 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. But of all the recognition and accolades, none meant more to Julia than the messages she received daily from women around the world. Women who had found the courage to walk away, to investigate, to trust their instincts. Women who had, because of her story, decided not to stay silent. "There's something I want to show you," Marcus said, stepping into the room with his phone in hand. He held it out to her. It came in this morning through the Phoenix Foundation site. Julia took the phone and read the email. From Sarah, Ohio. Subject: Thank you. Dear Mrs. Whitman, I watched your story on the news last year. It saved my life. I was married to a man who controlled every cent of our money. He told me I was too stupid to understand finances. I had to ask permission to buy groceries. After watching your interview, I started reading our bank statements. I found a secret credit card, $50,000 in debt, and an affair he'd been financing for years. I called the Phoenix Foundation's legal helpline. They connected me with an attorney. Today, I'm divorced, my assets are protected, and I'm living in my own apartment with my 2 kids. I'm working again as a nurse, and for the first time in 10 years, I feel like myself. Thank you for showing me I could fight for my future. With gratitude, Sarah, tears welled in Julia's eyes. This was why she had come forward, why she had risked public scrutiny and humiliation, why she worked 16-hour days, juggling a nonprofit and a newborn. Sarah's story wasn't rare. Marcus sat beside her. "We get emails like this every week," he said gently. "You've created something that's going to outlast all of us, Julia. You turned the worst moment of your life into a movement." Ethan began to fuss in her arms. Julia shifted her hold, rocking him gently with the rhythm that always calmed him. She looked down at him, this tiny life, this beautiful beginning, and thought of everything she was building for him. "I want him to be proud of me," she said softly, "not just of what I accomplished, but of how I handled it." Marcus reached over and took her hand. "He will be," he said. "But Julia, you should be proud of yourself too. You didn't just survive, you transformed everything around you." That afternoon, Julia received a call she had both expected and dreaded. Carter had been granted a supervised phone call and requested to speak with her. It would be their first direct conversation since the night of his arrest, over 18 months ago. Julia agreed, more out of curiosity than anything. What could he possibly say now? When his voice came through the line, she barely recognized it. Gone was the commanding presence, the polished charm that had once captivated her. He sounded older, worn down, hollow. "Julia," he said softly, "I know I don't have the right to call. I don't have the right to ask anything of you. But I needed you to know that I understand now what I lost." She said nothing, letting the silence press in. "I've had a lot of time to think about what I did to you, to our family, to the children who trusted the foundation. I can't undo any of it. But I am sorry. Not because I got caught, not because I'm in prison, but because I destroyed the best person I ever knew." Julia finally spoke, her voice measured. "What do you want from me, Carter? I want to know about our son. Is he healthy? Is he happy? Does he look like you? And is there any chance that someday when I'm out, I might be a part of his life?" Julia looked across the room at Ethan, sleeping soundly in his crib, his small chest rising and falling, his world safe and untouched by this conversation. "Our son's name is Ethan Marcus Whitman," she said. "He's healthy, he's beautiful, and when he's old enough, he'll know the truth about his biological father." She paused, then continued firmly. If one day Ethan decides he wants to know you, I won't stand in his way. But Carter, let me be clear, you will never be his father. A father protects, he sacrifices, he puts someone else's needs above his own. You didn't do that. You chose power. You chose deception. You chose to be a donor. Marcus chose to be a father. The line was silent. Finally, Carter asked, "Is Marcus? Are you too?" "That's not your concern anymore," Julia said without emotion. "Your concern should be becoming the kind of man who's worthy of forgiveness. Not from me, not from Ethan, but from yourself." The call ended. Julia sat quietly in her living room, the hum of the city outside barely audible above Ethan's soft breathing. She felt no satisfaction in Carter's pain, but she felt no pity either. Some bridges, once burned, were never meant to be rebuilt. That evening, Marcus came over for dinner, a routine they'd developed in the months since Ethan was born. As they cooked together in Julia's cozy, light-filled kitchen, she told him about Carter's call. "How do you feel about it?" Marcus asked, chopping red bell peppers while Julia stirred the marinara on the stove. "Neutral," Julia said, surprised by the honesty of her answer. "I don't hate him anymore, Marcus. I don't love him. I don't forgive him, but I don't hate him either." She paused, considering her words. "He's just irrelevant to my life now." Marcus nodded. "That's probably the healthiest thing you could feel." "And what about Ethan?" he asked gently. "How will you handle that as he gets older?" Julia had been thinking about that for a long time. "I'll tell him the truth, in ways he can understand, that his biological father made serious mistakes, that he hurt people, including me, that sometimes the people we love let us down. But that doesn't define us. It doesn't define him. I'll teach him that the people who choose to love us, the ones who show up, who stand by us like you, matter more than DNA ever could." Marcus stopped chopping. He turned and looked at her, really looked at her, with an expression of deep, unwavering love. "Julia," he said softly, "there's something I've been wanting to ask you." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small velvet box, and dropped to one knee right there, on the warm kitchen tile, surrounded by the scent of garlic and basil, the sound of baby Ethan gurgling in his bouncer nearby. "Julia Whitman," he said, voice steady, "will you marry me? Not because you need me, not because you need anyone, but because we choose each other, because we want to build something new, based on respect, equality, and love." Julia looked down at the ring. A simple, stunning sapphire encircled by delicate diamonds. It was nothing like the over-the-top, gaudy engagement ring Carter had once given her. This ring was elegant. It had been chosen for her, not for display. It reflected a love that had seen her fully and chosen her anyway. Tears filled her eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Marcus, I choose you too." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Julia felt something shift inside her, not about being proposed to or about being chosen, but about choosing herself, her truth, her future. She had fought for her life, she had protected her child, and now she was ready to build again. 1 year later, Julia and Marcus were married in a small, intimate ceremony in the garden behind her brownstone. Ethan, now walking and babbling nonstop, served as ring-bearer, guided adorably down the aisle by Julia's younger sister. The air was filled with laughter, joy, and the quiet strength of two people who had been through fire and chosen to rise together. The guest list was small: close friends, family, and several women whose lives had been transformed by the Horizon Project's outreach. As Julia walked down an aisle lined with daisies she had planted herself, she thought about the winding road that had brought her to this moment. The woman who had married Carter Whitman 5 years earlier had been seeking security, social status, and the kind of validation that came from being chosen by a man everyone admired. But the woman marrying Marcus Lee today? She needed none of that. She had created her own security, earned her own status, and validated herself through courage, conviction, and resilience. She was choosing Marcus not out of fear or desperation, but from strength, clarity, and love. In her vows, Julia spoke of second chances, of knowing the difference between settling and choosing, of what it meant to build a partnership grounded in mutual respect, not hierarchy. "Marcus," she said, her voice steady, "you've seen me at my most powerful and my most broken, and you've loved me in both spaces. You've never tried to dim my light, you've only helped me shine brighter. You stepped into Ethan's and my life, not to rescue us, but to walk beside us. I choose you, not because I need you, but because I want to build something beautiful with you. In the years that followed, Julia's story continued to empower women worldwide. The Horizon Project expanded across continents, offering legal aid, counseling, and housing solutions to women in more than 20 countries. Julia returned to architecture part-time, focusing on community housing and shelters for survivors of financial abuse. She and Marcus welcomed 2 more children, a daughter named Grace and a son named Noah. Ethan grew up confident and kind, supported by a family who taught him that love is chosen, not inherit. Carter Whitman was released from prison after serving 12 years. He tried reaching out to Julia a few times, but she never replied. She had meant what she said. He was irrelevant now. As for Vanessa, her real name uncovered and her deception exposed, she vanished after completing her sentence. Julia never thought about her again. On Ethan's 10th birthday, as she watched him blow out his candles surrounded by siblings, friends, and the man who had adopted him as his own, Julia reflected on that pivotal night at Lincoln Hall. She could have stayed silent. She could have accepted Carter's narrative and tried to cling to the life she thought she needed. Instead, she chose truth. She chose justice. She chose the uncertain future that lay ahead. It had been the best decision of her life. Later that night, after the kids were asleep, Julia and Marcus sat on their back porch beneath a sky littered with stars. The lights of Chicago twinkled in the distance. A cool breeze danced through the trees. Julia's phone buzzed. A message had come in, this one from a woman in Sweden. She had just left an abusive marriage after reading Julia's story. Julia looked up at the sky and smiled. Her past had once nearly destroyed her. Now, it was helping save lives. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd made different choices? Marcus asked one quiet night on the porch. Julia considered the question, not flippantly but with care. Sometimes, she admitted. But then I look at our life, our kids, the work we're doing, and I know that everything awful that happened brought me to everything beautiful I have now. I wouldn't change a thing. She leaned against Marcus's shoulder, feeling the steady presence of a man who didn't just tolerate her strength, but cherished it. Besides, Julia added with a wry smile, Carter Whitman thought he was removing an obstacle when he betrayed me. Instead, he created his worst nightmare, a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. And as the lights of Chicago shimmered below them, Julia Romanoff knew their story, her story, was still unfolding. One choice at a time. So the story is over. Our wonderful friends, are you still here with us at this hour? If you're still watching, still listening, then something in this journey has touched your heart in some quiet, powerful way. Maybe it was Julia's courage, maybe it was the fire of truth, maybe it was just the reminder that we're not as alone as we sometimes feel. This story wasn't just about betrayal, or even revenge. It was about reclaiming your power when the world tries to take it away. It was about becoming the version of yourself that refuses to be silent. And maybe most importantly, it was about protecting what matters most, no matter the cost. Julia taught us that healing doesn't always come gently. Sometimes, healing arrives with confrontation, with fire, with truth spoken into microphones and broadcast to rooms full of people who thought you were done. There's a quote by Glennon Doyle that says, "We can do hard things." But she also said something even more important. The braver we are, the luckier we get. And Julia? She was brave enough to bet on herself, even when everything around her was crumbling. That's a reminder we can all carry. So if you're in a place right now where you're doubting your strength, doubting your worth, please remember, you are more powerful than you know. Your story isn't over. You're still writing it, one choice at a time. If this story moved you, helped you see yourself more clearly, or reminded you of someone you love, please don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that matter. Because the world doesn't just need more noise, it needs more truth, more healing, and more of you. We'll see you in the next story.